Hey everyone, thanks for taking this masterclass. My name is Darko Mitev and I'm a lead character artist in Brownback Films. And today we're going to talk about designing and modeling character for animated production. Some of the rules that I'm going to talk about, they're going to be more towards TV show animation rather than feature film, but all the techniques apply. So in this specific example, I'm going to start with no concept, just because I wanted to explore a little bit of a design workflow as well. But usually in a production environment, you would have some sort of concept provided to you to start, unless you're on a very beginning of a TV show or a feature film where they either don't have the concept done or they're very loose. You might be asked to kind of do rough sketch. So what I do in this case is I start with a Z-sphere template from ZBrush, and I kind of move it around just to get the basic proportions that I like. After that, convert that to polygons and start moving the shapes around to start to get the basic premise of the character. For a good while, I'm not going to worry about the design too much. At this point, I want to focus on getting a workable, generic kind of human that would kind of inspire me to work on the character later. So some of the stuff that I'm going to sketch right now will become obsolete later, and that's perfectly fine. The reason that I'm doing this is A, it's a good practice of stylized anatomy, and B, you kind of set yourself up for success later down the road. In this course, we're gonna go over the entire process. So I will kind of guide you step by step when we come to the different stages. At this point, what I really want to focus on is getting a strong silhouette. And I really want to get the character to feel right before I do any specific design of the features of the face or anything like that. So this also is a good idea to have this kind of a template that you can reuse for other characters to start from. And this would be the exact same approach that I would do if I have a concept in mind as well. I would either have the concept imported in ZBrush and then use this kind of method to block out the major masses and the primary shapes of the character, and then I would start to refine that and getting it closer to the concept. So doing a little bit of a cleanup work, and then I'm gonna subdivide and I'm gonna start working on the basic anatomy of this guy. Although he's going to be fully covered with clothing, it's always a great idea to start with some sort of kind of defined anatomical model underneath, just because it's going to be a lot easier for when it comes to measuring where things should be, and if you need to swap different outfits for the character, it's always a good practice to have an underlying body that looks good, especially in a production environment or like a TV show, like animated TV show or feature film. Most likely the characters you're going to work on, they're going to receive different outfits throughout the show. So they're going to change clothing and stuff like that. So it's always a good idea to have a nice working body underneath. So as you can see, I'm going around the limbs and I'm kind of trying to make this interlocking shape, almost like a toy soldier figurine. And that kind of is a very quick way to get the overlapping shapes to read and look nice. And also, when we smooth things out, a lot of this is gonna get very smoothed out, but it will give a bit more realistic feel to the character. So defining some of the bony landmark and some of the major anatomical muscle groups would would kind of greatly help me when it comes down to figuring out the design. Right now I'm still not thinking about the actual design of the character too much. I just try to make it to the point where he's starting to look like a generic character. I kind of have in my head a vision of what kind of a character he would be. So I'm going for a little bit of a elderly character that kind of feels young and feels very energetic. So when you kind of see him, you kind of get this positive vibe. So I kind of made up a little story around him. So he used to be this rock kind of a person who enjoyed biking. So he had like a fancy motorbike, and he probably was like in a motorbike gang or something like that. So he's gonna have a very particular style when it comes to the clothing, and the story kind of I kind of made a little bit of twist to the story. Is so he kind of gets retired to a very nice mountain village, and he's starting to kind of pick up a lot of those habits and ways people dress around him. So he's still kind of clinging to his old ways as much as possible, but he starts to assimilate a little bit, and that's going to be reflected in the clothing design later on. So for the most part, we're looking for semi-athletic, kind of elderly character that would feel very energetic and would give out positive vibes. I kind of have a vision in my head to expand this project into making an environment and making a cool pose for the character to showcase him in, and probably that's something that I'm going to be working on next after this masterclass is over. But for this guy, as you're gonna see, I'm not gonna stay married to this initial design for too long, just because I look at this as I don't want to say a throwaway sculpt, because nothing you do is really a throwaway, because I save duplicates of my sculpt before I do any major change. But I kind of want to think about this, blocking out the major shapes, making him read nice, and then after I have something that looks pretty good, I can start to think about the actual design I want to have for him. And that's a very nice start, because it's gonna give me a base that I can reuse for other characters, like I mentioned before. And I kind of start very sculpturally. I'm not gonna go in extrude individual toes or fingers at this point. For the hand, I did start it with a Z-sphere hand, but I'm gonna chop it later and replace it with a different hand. But for the toes, she's gonna wear shoes, and so I don't want to worry too much about that. The foot kind of feels long, so I decided to kind of shrink it down and reproportion it a little bit. This is gonna change like a million times throughout this process. So like I'm trying to work the overall character to the same level, not focusing too much on one area. So as soon as something feels, okay-ish, I leave it and I jump to another area. So now the thing that starts to bother me is I have no ears on the character, and the head is like there's no eyes. So I wanted to get a little bit more feel, a bit more read of the character. And because you cannot really insert a mesh when you have subdivisions, I duplicated the head and I dynameshed it, and I'm going to start fleshing out some of the features, and I'm going to start I'm going to insert a couple of spheres for the ears, and I'm going to try to move some shapes around to kind of get something that that I like. So here I go, just inserting very simple, kind of inserting spheres, squashing them down, and then duplicating that again to make the connection with the backside of the head as well. It's a fairly simple technique, and it works really well, because when you have the ears as a separate mesh, it's very easy to move them around and adjust them without disturbing the the surrounding of the model, like the cheekbones and stuff like that. So I'm being very, very rough with this stage, and that's because I want to move fast. I don't want to spend too much time on the blockout stage because I want to spend the time when it comes to designing. This is still kind of like a in-between stage where we're kind of figuring the character out. We're blocking a lot of the shapes, but not really honing in on the actual design itself. So again, inserting another sphere for the eyes, and there are a couple of ways that you can do eyelids. You can take some of the curved brushes and wrap them around. You can sculpt the eyelids like I would do for in this case. And this is a bit more traditional, more sculptural method, and I like it because it gives me a better read very, very quickly. The downside is, if you're quite new to sculpting, what this can do is make things look a little lumpy. So you kind of need to be careful on how you approach things and need to clean up as you go, which for me, especially at this stage, is perfectly fine because, like I mentioned, this is not going to stay as it is. And here I'm measuring to see that the upper eyelid should be forward in the lower eyelid, just to kind of give this natural feel and also allow for nice animation later down the road. So almost done with the blocking out stage of this, and after this I'm gonna quickly jump in and block some of the hair volumes and beard, which I'm gonna do by masking and extracting. And I decided to try and give him a bit of a mustache, just to kind of see if I'm gonna like the direction that's going. And so just taking the inflate brush and inflating the the middle section, and then using the smooth brush to kind of taper as it goes towards the tip. And then here goes the beard itself. Like I said, I don't try to do anything fancy here. I'm not using any fancy techniques. It's literally just masking out and extracting pieces. There are probably a lot simpler ways to do, a lot cleaner ways, rather I should say, to do beards and stuff like that. But because we don't have a specific design that we follow, and we are not really trying to be clean and polished at this stage, it's perfectly fine. And at every stage you're gonna see me refining the shapes and changing the proportions, and that's just part of my workflow. I always try to see things in context, so I would block things out, I would zoom out, look at the model from a distance, and then go back, change some stuff, work on secondary shapes, take a break maybe, and maybe next day see it again. And so that's always a good idea to kind of take a break from the model and come back to it, especially if you're designing things and like if you're not following any particular concept, because usually your first idea is never your best idea, unless like you've done a lot of designs and you know your subject extremely well. But even then, I would argue that if you try multiple ideas, chances are you're going to end up with a better one than the very first one that you do. So this is exactly what I did here. Is after doing this initial sculpt of the hair and head proportion, I took a little bit of a break, maybe like I don't know, like a couple of hours break. And then when I come back to it, he felt a little bit too generic. So I kind of decided to switch things up a little bit and try something different, trying to see if I can make him look and feel a bit more unique. And so what I'm gonna do next is I'm gonna see the model in context, and after you know, comparing it to, you know, to the rest of the body, and, you know, to the idea that I kind of have in my head, I'm gonna try to see if I can come up with better design. And this is the stage where I'm slowly starting to kind of really think about the design, who this character is, you know, what was his, you know, his life like. And this, especially when you're designing, this is very important, because this information would greatly impact the way your character looks. So every time you're designing something, whether it's 2D or 3D, try to kind of make story and answer a lot of questions, like as much as questions as you can, because the more you know about the character, the more informed decisions you can make about the design itself. For example, if he was somebody who was outdoors on the sun for a long time, he would probably have a lot more wrinkles around the eyes, because he would be squinting a lot more because of the intensity of the sun and stuff like that. If he was somebody who had a very rough life, maybe he was in a war or something like that, maybe he would have like a scar or anything like that. So all of these things gonna very much influence the look of your character. So don't underestimate the story aspect of it, and try to kind of keep it. Try to think about that, you know, over and over again, because the more you kind of add to the story, the more you're gonna evolve your design in a better way. And so here is actually like when I took the break and I started to think about what is his personality like. Maybe he was like a punk rock kind of a guy in, you know, in his youth, and maybe he's still kind of trying to keep his cool beard and mustache shapes. And I started to kind of visualize how he would look like if he wear a hat. And maybe like he started to get bald because, you know, he's getting you know, older. So you know, as you're gonna see, his design is gonna change drastically. And I'm keeping a copy of the old design just so I can compare, because not everything you do you're gonna like it instantly. So having your old sculpt as a comparison would be you know, very beneficial for you. And here, so I was like that the body is looking very generic. Maybe, you know, when he got to the mountains and he started enjoying the food and everything, maybe like he was, you know, slender his entire life, but now he's starting to get a little bit more of a belly going on. And it's actually a little bit of homage to a friend of mine that I kind of joke around with, because he was very slim his entire life, and then he started to kind of settle down a little bit, and he started to, you know, enjoy computer life a little bit too much, and he started to have a little bit of a belly. Not nearly as much as what I'm going to exaggerate here, but it's just one of those things that you kind of notice in real life that you can translate to your CG designs. So here, as you're going to see, I pretty much destroyed a lot of the stuff that I've sculpted, and that's perfectly fine. Like I mentioned, it's a good practice, and it takes very few minutes to sculpt it back. And because I've smoothed everything down on the lowest subdivision level, when I subdivide, I still kind of get like a roadmap of where things were when they got before they got erased. So it kind of gives me like you know, like a map of where things where should I build things up again. And here I'm redoing pretty much you know, the anatomy bits, and I'm kind of trying to think about how much fat he's gonna have versus, you know, he's like skinny fat kind of personality. And you know, because this is an exploration stage, it's bound to look weird for a certain amount of time before you figure out what you really want to do with it. So you're gonna see he's gonna start to look you know, a little bit of, you know, a little strange for a while. He's gonna, so like some places gonna feel like unproportional, he's gonna get fat and then slim and then fat, and and it's all part of the process of the exploration process. I'm really not precious about my strokes in my design, because as I said, I'm a very strong believer in exploration and iteration. So the more you iterate, the more you're gonna notice stuff, and the more you're gonna adapt and evolve your design. While I'm doing this, I'm kind of trying to keep in mind the basic design principles of straight versus curves, complex versus simple side. So for example, if I look at the character from the side view, I'm going to try to keep, for example, like the lower leg, I'm going to try to keep it very simple on the front side where the shin bone is, and then where the calf muscles are, I'm going to, add a bit more complexity. And, all of these kind of stuff would greatly impact the read of the character. So again, changing proportions, and here I'm starting to slowly like the design and where it's going, and pretty soon actually I'm gonna be wrapping this up, because I kind of I kind of work half and half when it comes to modeling versus sculpting. I was a traditional box modeler before I picked up ZBrush and started sculpting, so I still like to keep a lot of my work in in my modeling application, rather than just as a pure sculpt, because at the end of the day, the ZBrush model can look amazing, but if your model, like if your polygonal model does not reflect that when you retopologize and when you get it all ready for production, then well, it's a pity, because you've spent all this time making it look great in ZBrush, and then topology for production has certain limitations, and there's certain things that like you can't really do, and I try to kind of keep that in mind when I work, just so that okay, so yeah, here I'm comparing the two designs, and I'm like definitely deciding to go on the other one. You can see how much more character and appeal it has. So yeah, I was saying that you kind of want to keep in mind how things are going to look when you retopologize, which would be our next step. And for the retopology itself, I use Maya as my primary software. And because I started with the ZBrush, the Z-sphere rig, when you convert that to polygons, you get a pretty decent topology to start with. So I'm deleting some patches that are not really working, and I've exported the lowest subdivision level, and I've also exported the decimated version. And here I'm using that as a starting point, and I'm continuing that work from there. So I'm using Maya's quadra tools for topology, and I'm kind of trying to get an outline of the pectoralis muscle going around and the deltoid. So I'm trying to think about how would this deform in animation, and I'm laying down the topology so that it would make sense for deformation purposes. And this is a very complex topic, and there's no real defined rule on how you should make your topology, because I've worked with many productions that have a completely contradictory topology from another, and they all work well. So some people like to keep the topology as simple and as grid-like as possible. A lot of productions, they tend to outline the muscles with topology as well, so you can get all your super crispy muscly definition from ZBrush back into your model, and they all have good and bad sides about them. One very big limitation, especially for TV show production, is your clothing topology should match very closely your underlying body topology. So the more twists and turns and muscle striation you have in your body topology, you're gonna have to carry all of that when you do your clothing. So something to keep in mind. So I kind of want to work kind of like in between. Like as you can see here, I'm gonna use this kind of like a radial patch that would kind of help keep some of the elbow, like bony landmark definition a little bit. But I'm not gonna go too crazy and start outlining, every little muscle for the the forearm and for the legs, because that's just gonna make things a lot more complicated when it comes to making the rest of the character work nicely. So same thing with the knees and the back side of the legs. I try to keep things as grid-like, as I mentioned, as possible, and then I would add only necessary kind of like modeling junctions, like kites and stuff like that, only where I need them to make sure that I have all my topology working for me. For the foot, as you saw there, I pretty much decided to ignore the toes, and I'm gonna have like a sock because he's gonna have a boots and stuff like that. So I'm not gonna spend the polygon budget and model individual toes in this case. For the face, I start by outlining the biggest forms and deformation areas. So I'm gonna make almost like a frame where how I want my topology to flow, and then the rest would be just filling in the blanks in between. So I always have loops following the nasolabial fold. I have radial loops around the mouth and the eye areas, around the kind of like simulating the muscle flow around like the eye, for example, the orbicularis muscle, and as I mentioned, nasolabial fold and stuff like that. One thing very important is I try to keep like a mask loop, almost like a superhero mask around around the eye area. And this is kind of important because if you want to reuse this character, it's something we do in production all the time is we reuse topology from one character to another. So trying to make your topology generic so you can make a different character out of this would be very beneficial if you can do. And there are a couple of rules you should follow for that kind of stuff, and that is areas where more than 4 polygons meet, like we usually refer to them as stars. They should be on the same edge loop, meaning all the way around the eye, all the stars are going to be on the same edge loop. And what that does is, if let's say you sculpt another character in ZBrush and you want to reuse this topology, what you can do is you can use those star points as your markers, and then you can pretty much select and detach the entire eye from one character and move it over to your new sculpt, and then you can just excuse me, reproject those details, reproject the topology to get the details from your new sculpt. And that is very useful, and it's one of the techniques we use in production all the time. That is if you don't have plugins like ZWrap. If you have ZWrap or Wrap 3, the full version of it, that those kind of plugins, they start to change a little bit the workflows. But I just wanted to mention this because it's still a very relevant thing and something we do in production, especially in animation production. So as you can see, most of this is, once I get this template flowing the way I want, I'm just gonna start inserting edge loops in between these areas and filling in the gaps with patches of polygons, and I'm gonna get to the a more complete version of the face very, very quickly. And that is something you want to do. You want to find ways to be efficient in your workflow, because a lot of times these kind of, especially on a new show, for example, changes are bound to happen. So if you are somebody that can make a quick topology version of your or design sculpt, and you can give it to rigging for testing purposes, your animation directors and your pretty much production is going to love you, because there are a lot of things that you can't really predict until you start to see the character moving, and you give it to the hands of an animator and they start to push it, and they start to kind of like break the character. They push it to the limits, till the point where starts to break. And that's really something you want to do very early, because you want to know if your design is functional, not just looking good, because this kind of character is gonna perform in various different scenarios in a production. And one thing that directors and animation directors are really looking to is to be able to get the most out of the performance of the character. And your topology needs to serve that purpose. You don't just add topology to to make things look nice. Every loop that I add here has a specific reason, and it's because either because I want to keep things from the sculpt that are necessary to convey the design, or they are needed for production purposes. One thing that I changed my mind about is you can see this radial loop going right above the chin and going up into the mouth. That was something that I wanted to kind of capture the the form of the sculpt, but then I realized that that's going to make a little bit of a problem when it comes to blend shapes and to animation. And I want to make animation friendly character, because like that's the purpose of the whole masterclass. So I checked it here against the sculpt, and I was getting really nice deformation, not deformation, but a really nice read from the character. It was matching the sculpt very accurately. But after a bit of thinking, I decided to change that and continue the nasolabial fold loop to go all the way down and around the chin, and that is something that I'll be adding, or rather changing very, very quickly. So as you can see, getting to the final stage now, once I get all this foundation, is very, very simple. I just add loop between each establishing loop that I did, and I use my relax brush to kind of relax everything. And here's when I started to kind of think about, well, how can I improve this? Just because you did something and you spend the time doesn't mean it's perfect. If you have to redo things to make it work, now it's the best time to do it. And this is something that you're gonna see in production a lot, is people tend to make time for the important things. And if it means you spending another week retopologizing the character just to get the performance that the directors and animation directors need from the character, then so be it. That is at the end of the day the most important thing. That's why we are making this character, to see him perform and do the stuff that it's written in the scripts and all that stuff. So yeah, just by redirecting this, this is going to give us a lot more better deformation in the cheeks and in the mouth area. And one thing that you kind of do is make sure that you have enough loops for your eyelids, and your eyelids kind of follow the the design sculpt very, very closely. Eyes are something that is very, very important to get right in your characters, because that's the first thing that we kind of look at, and we kind of connect with the character through the eyes. So a good rule of thumb is to have at least 4 edge loops for your eyelids to be able to close properly when you're doing blend shapes. So I'm gonna use that rule over here. So 4 edge loops from the top of the eyelid to the bottom, and then I'm gonna spread them around just a little bit to get a bit more even distribution. One other very important thing is that the number of edges you have on the top eyelid should reflect the number of edges you have on the bottom. So when they close, they should match perfectly, and that would give you a very nice deformation. Because this guy has a very pronounced eyebrows, I decided to give it a radial loop around the eyebrows, which would kind of serve me as kind of like encapsulating the eyebrow region a little bit more. And after this, I'm gonna switch gears and I'm gonna show you the final topology, because at the back of the head and the ear is pretty much using the same technique, just extruding a frame around the skull and then just filling in the gaps in a grid-like formation. And so here I'm gonna use a mirror to kind of mirror the head, and we're gonna jump into the clothing next. I already had a hat model from a different character, so I decided to reuse it. And as you're gonna see here, the shirt that I have at the moment as a base is pretty much taking the body and extracting, like duplicating those faces and just moving them out so they're not flush to the surface. Excuse me. I'm a big fan of modeling props and clothing by hand instead of sculpting them in ZBrush first, just because I feel like you get a lot more for the time you spend. Like if, let's say, you spend couple of days making a very nice shirt and trousers and boots in ZBrush, and you sculpt your beautiful wrinkles and everything, and you get an approval from your art direction, then what needs to happen is you need to pretty much redo this kind of process. You're gonna retopologize that, but also you need to make sure that you follow the topology of the body, and that can take a lot more time, because now you're trying to figure out how to get the wrinkles and all the details from the sculpt look nice. In the same time, you're trying to match the topology of the underlying body. So because, like I mentioned, I am kind of used to modeling things by hand, I try to make my topology work for me. And the rule for this kind of stuff is you can have more edges in between the edges of your body topology, but you shouldn't have less, or you shouldn't move them around too much. Like you can even cut diagonal edges if you want to go across polygons, as long as you keep those polygons, the grid-like polygons intact, and you kind of work around that. And you can see me do that around the armpit areas and the crotch areas on the trousers. And so this is very much a manual kind of labor, just taking the cut tool and modeling wrinkle by wrinkle, and trying to kind of think how things would deform and how things would fold if this was a shirt, a blouse, sorry. Also, one thing to kind of keep in mind is the thickness of your wrinkles will also determine the material. So you don't want to make, let's say you want to make a thick sweater kind of material for your clothing. You don't want to make your wrinkles too skinny, too tight, rather I should say, because that is a material property for a lighter material and not for something thick like a woven sweater or sweatshirt or something like that. So here I'm using a lot of references on my second monitors of the type of clothing I want to make for this guy, and that helps a lot. And using Edit Edge Flow to kind of ease in a lot of these wrinkles, I kind of tend to work in passes. I would kind of sketch them out, trying to get the basic feel for it, and then I would kind of give it a break and come back to it and start to refine it and think about think about a little more about how things would deform and stuff like that. So you're gonna see me here around the elbow. I'm gonna work around the bending point of the elbow, but I'm not gonna really try to make any creases that would clash too much, because that's an area that is gonna deform quite a lot, and I don't want to make too much details, because when things start to stretch and squash, you can get your stretching in the texture maps. So it's something to kind of keep in mind, is trying to keep your deformation areas a little bit cleaner, or have wrinkles that would deform along with the mesh. So here I decided to reuse the other, I already made this kind of piece for one side of the shirt, and I decided to reuse it. And just to kind of make things a little bit asymmetrical, I thought that I would kind of raise up the sleeve a little bit, and so it's kind of like it's wrinkly, and it would give me a lot a lot more interesting silhouette than having both of the sleeve to be perfectly symmetrical. And I also tend to use Maya sculpting tools a lot to kind of make things a bit more organic. And just a quick bridge here, because these are the same number of spans on both sides. It's a very quick to add a lot of a bridge and kind of fill in the gaps. And here is where I kind of decided to make things, like a almost like a folded sleeve. So it's same kind of techniques apply for this kind of stuff. Adding more edge loops in between and just moving them up and down, and use a slight rotation. I'm also trying to keep in mind what edges should I keep straight to kind of follow the underlying body topology, and then if I move that edge, I would add another one to kind of support that, and just adding overlap, because fabric will not just bubble up like that, it will kind of like fold on itself. So this definitely is a little bit slower than if you were to sculpt this in ZBrush, but the good thing is, after you're done with this, you pretty much have your design sculpt but also final model in the same time. And even better thing is, if art direction approve this, then this is the final model, and you don't need to tweak anything or fight with the topology to get the final look. And so here is what I mentioned, like you can cut diagonal lines to kind of make diagonal wrinkles and stuff like that, but I'm also trying to work around that limitation that my topology needs to follow the topology of the body. So as you can see, I'm still trying to keep all of those topology to kind of work as grid-like as possible. And if you have a little modification here and there, it's no big deal. Like you can get away with a lot, even if you have a bit of a twisting and turning in the topology there. It's still not that big of a deal. And here I decided to add a bit of a seam line to the shirt, and that is pretty much using the move brush and beveling the edge first, and using the move brush to kind of do the same thing. And I would do that differently on the left and the right side whenever possible, just because things like clothing, they're not symmetrical in real life, right? Like they kind of conform to the body and to the position of of your body. So I am a big believer that you should kind of induce a little bit of asymmetry if you can. And because we've already made this clothing very asymmetrical from the get-go, I figured we might as well start to add these kind of details and make them asymmetrical as well. It doesn't look like like much, but these kind of details can go a long way by making your model feel a bit more natural and and believable. Like obviously we're not going for, you know, what I would say a realistic kind of thing, but the more you can do to, you know, imply that this was a manufactured piece, it's gonna help. With the visual, you know, interest. So stuff like adding seam lines, where, you know, a real shirt would have, and having that, like the cuffs of the sweater be, you know, a different material, and stuff like that would be a, you know, a very big plus for, you know, just getting to what I would say like the next level. And like you see, I'm trying to add edge loops to go all the way around, but because of that diagonal line that I cut in, I have to manually excuse me, stop and, you know, redraw some of those areas. You know, which is not a big deal. It's just something to, you know, to kind of keep in mind. And that would pretty much excuse me, that would pretty much be our you know, shirt design. I would add a little bit more details in, like in the middle, just to kind of you know, make it look folded. Like he has obviously a bit of a belly, so I thought it would be funny to kind of add like a little wrinkle where like that fold of the shirt is kind of like resting on top of the belly, just to kind of emphasize how big it is, and just, you know, move down the, you know, the fold to kind of imply that there's like a gravity affecting it. It's not just, you know, sticking out in the air. And that's, yeah, something that I wanted to actually touch base is you kind of want to, when you're modeling these kind of things by hand, trying to think about, you know, gravity and how that would affect the folds. And so after you cut in, make sure you kind of go with either with a move brush or, you know, with your standard, you know, modeling, you know, manipulator, and trying to add a little bit of a weight to those folds. And I'm gonna like leave, for example, the shirt right now as it is, but when I'm done with, let's say, the trousers and the gloves and the boots, I'm gonna again make just a short break to kind of get my mind off of the project, to kind of forget you know, what I was doing, and then come back to it maybe like a day later or something like that, and look at it again and see it with fresh eyes, and try to see like what I missed, what can I improve, what you know, doesn't work, and stuff like that. And stuff like thickness on clothing is something we cheat a lot in animation production. Like we kind of want to imply thickness around, you know, the cuffs and that kind of stuff, but we don't really have thickness all the way around. So here's another great example of working with limitations to kind of make the pockets. I know that I have to obey the topology on the body, like I mentioned like 100 times by now. So I'm kind of extracting a piece from the clothing and adding a little bit of extra edge loops to kind of work around it. But for the most part, the internal edge loops mirror the edge loops of the pants and then on the body. So that is something that, you know, you kind of have to be creative with, as you know, when it comes to working with you know, clothing and stuff like that. This I should mention, this method means that your clothing is not going to get simulated, but rather it's going to get rigged and it's going to move with the character. So that's, you know, very important. If you were doing a simulation kind of workflow mesh, then a lot of these, you know, stuff that I'm, you know, modeling, like all the wrinkles that I'm modeling by hand and all the, you know, the topology that I'm kind of worrying about is not as you know, as important. You know, simulation tends to work better if your meshes are you know, as grid-like as possible, or uniform polygons, I should say. And that's why when you like get stuff from like software for like Marvelous Designer, for example, they are like as even quads as possible or triangles, just because the algorithm would have a lot easier time simulating if all the polygons are, you know, similar size, rather than trying to figure out how to simulate a large polygon next to very, you know, few smaller ones. And the design of the trousers is gonna change a little bit from what I'm gonna show in this video, and mainly it's for the, you know, for the wrinkles around the crotch area and the folded you know, piece of clothing around the calf muscles. That is something that you kind of need to see it before you know it, you know, before you know if it's gonna work or not. And one way you can do that is you can take a screenshot and go to Photoshop and try to doodle, you know, around on top of your model. And that is actually what I did after this modeling session. So this session was done like all at once. So I kind of in one sitting I kind of fleshed out the, you know, all the pieces of clothing, and then I took a break and I took some screenshots and I went to Photoshop and tried to mess around with you know, some drawers, and then I look at some references and I realized that some of the wrinkles that I have right now around the crotch area and, you know, something that I'm gonna add like around the knees and stuff like that, they kind of tend to look a little bit too tight, and they make the material very kind of like almost leathery like. And I was going for more of a skinny jeans. They're still kind of very close to the body, but not as, you know, as body wrapping as leather pants would be, for example. And so yeah, and that's something that you're gonna see in the final model, that is gonna change, you know, just a little bit. For the most part, everything that I do and show right now is gonna stay the same. They're just like tiny little details that it would take a lot of time to figure out, because I would go back and forth and you know, maybe add it, remove it, or just add it and then emphasize it a little bit more. Maybe do a couple of renders, you know, try different materials, and then, you know, see if the wrinkles read properly, and then if they don't, I go back and I try to make them a little thicker, or if they're too thick, try to, you know, make them thinner, and vice versa. So yeah, all of this is pretty much trying to work with, you know, the limitations of the topology that you already have preset, but adding all the details. And as you can see, it is doable. It just, you know, it's a little bit of kind of like a tricky thing to figure out. But if you do it, you know, a couple of times, it's something that you can, you know, it's definitely a skill that you need to master. But once you have it mastered, it's very easy. For the shoes, I started with a basic shoe that I modeled, I don't even know how many years ago now. and I reuse these shoes more times than I can count, to be honest. And it's generic enough that it doesn't represent anything in particular, and it has a very kind of low poly count, and it's very easily adjustable. So as you can see here, I will change this to look completely different than, you know, the base, you know, and you know what it looks like right now. But it's gonna save me, you know, a little bit of time. You know, starting from a box, it's always, you know, gonna be slower. So I always tend to have these kind of little props, you know, and parts laying around, like buttons and belt buckles and, you know, shoes and even pockets. I have kind of like a library, like a small library of different pockets wrapped to a NURB plane that I can just insert and kind of like move around and attach to my character, and then rework the topology if needed. And the shoe is pretty much the same process. Like, I'm gonna start to sound like a broken record here, but it really is as simple as it as it sounds. You take the base model, you kind of take your soft selection and you move it around, and you pretty much try to work out the design, looking at references as much as possible to make sure that you keep yourself in check, that you're not doing stuff that wouldn't work. Adding support edges after you've blocked things out, and just going from there. Another very important aspect of especially designing character in 3D directly is art direction and feedback. Art directors exist for a reason, and I do not consider myself a designer or an art director by any means of the word. I do tend to kind of want I do tend to kind of design my own character as much as possible because I want to get better at it. But there are people who studied this a long time, and they would kind of give you an insight of things that you wouldn't necessarily think about. So something that I do is I would often get a screenshot to some of my colleagues, like their art directors or senior designers and stuff like that, and just openly ask for feedback. And there's nothing wrong with that. Just because you're a badass modeler doesn't mean you're a badass designer. There is definitely a skill that needs learning, and the more you do it, the better you get, obviously. But it's something that you need to work on. The shoelaces are as simple as they look. I took a NURBS curve, I make the shoe live, and then I started drawing the curve in a crisscross formation going all the way up, and then I tied the knot without stopping. I kind of like went in circles and tied the knot down and continued all the way down on the other side and connected. And then I went in and I kind of offset the vertices to go up and down, so they kind of formed the shoelaces. And then again, same technique for the sock, extracting pieces from the body. This actually is a work in progress sock that I'm going to show here. At a later stage, I'm going to decide to kind of make one of the shoes broken. So I'm gonna finish the rest of the sock going all the way around the foot. But at this stage, I was not really thinking about doing something like that, so I only did it halfway. And this kind of shows you of like what we do to kind of keep our polygon budget low, because if you start going too dense, then your animator is gonna have hard time animating this and having a real-time preview. And that is very important to kind of have a real-time preview when you're animating. So I know my girlfriend is an animator, so I know how much she hates to have heavy models that can't really interact in the viewport. So every time I can, I try to kind of think about what's next after me down the pipeline. And I want to make other people's lives easier as well, not just gonna selfishly think about making my model as perfect as possible and looking great, and then everybody down the pipeline is gonna can't render it because it's too high res, or animation would scream at you and stuff like that. So yeah, another thing is I decided to give him this kind of like chopped kind of gloves look to kind of get with that I'm cool vibe. And again, the exact same technique, selecting the faces, extracting them, and simulating the thickness around the fingers. And then I'm gonna take the move brush. I'm gonna add a couple of loops just to kind of add a bit more detail. And then I'm gonna take my move brush and my scale tools and start to move them around. I want to make it a little bit more messy and a bit more cloth-like. And a lot of this is gonna get done after this in ZBrush. I'm gonna take this into ZBrush and I'm gonna sculpt some more wrinkles. But as a base model, you want to keep things as clean as possible, but also as organic as possible. So here I need to add a seam line, so I'm kind of cutting diagonally across, and I'm gonna need to add a few more edge loops to kind of support that, and again, working with that, with the limitations that you have. And that I can excuse me, and that actually I would use as advantage when I start to add the wrinkles, because all of those kind of twists and turns that you add with the topology can actually serve as a nice way to add a bit more detail. Next up, we're gonna look at making the belt, and that is gonna sound, exactly like I do. So here is reusing parts like buckles and buttons and stuff like that. I'm gonna take one of those and I'm gonna try to fit it to, first of all, I'm gonna look at a few of them and decide which one is, gonna work for the type of pants that I have, and then extracting the piece from the trousers and just extruding around to kind of, make a belt-like shape. A belt is something that is going to be very, very closely connected to the trousers themselves. So it's one of those pieces that you really want to pay attention to, that your topology is as close as possible to the underlying, to the trousers. Stuff like clothing, we usually have a secondary controls for sleeves and jackets and dresses and stuff like that animators can kind of use to animate around and like do some secondary movements to kind of simulate that this is it to kind of simulate simulation pretty much, to kind of cheat simulation not simulate simulation. But stuff like belts and the gloves, they pretty much gonna be skin wrapped to the body. So this is one of those areas where you really want to pay attention to get it right. And one thing also is gonna good to mention is thickness of objects. Whenever you're working, make sure that the thickness of all of the clothing parts is consistent. Meaning if you establish that jeans would be a certain thickness, then you kind of need to go and make sure that a belt is proportionally thick to the thickness of the jeans, and then the shirt and the vest and everything else that you're gonna add, and jacket, it's also gonna be proportionally thick to that, and that is it's a common mistake that I've seen in a lot of especially junior people's work, is you would have something way too thick and some things like not thick enough, and it kind of breaks the illusion that it breaks the cohesiveness of the character rather. So here I'm like meticulously comparing to the underline edges and making sure that I have enough resolution to model the details I need, but I also kind of I also keep in mind the underlying structure of the topology, and I'm gonna try to add a little bit of like deformation and wear to this guy, and a lot of this again is gonna come when I go to ZBrush and sculpt some of the details. Unfortunately, I didn't have a lot of time to showcase too much of that in this demo, but it's something that usually is done either by a texture artist or a modeler. It depends on the pipeline. I would say if you are working in a standard TV show, like animated TV show production, this is not going to be your job. Like those details going to be a texture artist job. So that's why I kind of decided to skip on that section. because that heavily involves like UDIMs and how the UVs are set up and shaders and stuff like that. So for a nice presentation, I decided to kind of make a simple backdrop and a generic, gray material. And this is something we do for dailies all the time. I've grouped the entire character into one group, and I just made a simple rotation animation, rotating the character 360 degrees in a span of, 200 frames or something like that. And I'm gonna set up my camera to be 60mm lens, and that's a very common camera used for shooting in TV show animation. So we kind of keep that focal length. I'm gonna be using redshift for this, and I'm gonna be using global illumination. So I'm going over setting up my redshift settings. I'm using brute force with irradiance point cloud. And I'm gonna place my key light, and I'm gonna place a couple of bounce lights and kick lights. So some of them are gonna be for emphasizing the silhouette of the characters, and others would be for making the character read a little bit better. So after placing my key light, which is usually the strongest light source in your lighting rig, I'm gonna start duplicating around, and I'm gonna create what we call a rim light. And as you're gonna see, redshift lights by default have visible turned on, which means that they're gonna render as cards. So I'm gonna go quickly to my render settings, my attribute editor rather, and disable that switch. And I'm gonna do 2 rim lights, and then I'm gonna make a fill light. And for a moment, the character is gonna start to look a little bit flat, and that's because I haven't adjusted my lights yet. So as you're gonna see, the rim lights really help outline the silhouette of the character. But if you make them too strong, then they're gonna start to kind of like fight with the key light a little bit, and it's gonna make things look a little bit flat. That's why I'm gonna duplicate the key light. I'm gonna flip it on the other side and give it a very low intensity, and gonna use it more of a filler light, just to kind of add a little bit more light and kind of reduce some of the contrast. I know that my shaders are gonna be kind of clay based, so I'm giving a little bit more light, just because I know that I'm gonna have a little bit darker shaders. And this is something that in production you would have already preset by your lighting department, but I wanted to kind of give you an overview of how you would do it for yourself. For the background, as you're gonna see, because it was kind of dimming very quickly, I decided to assign a shadow catcher material, which pretty much makes the background look very like flat, like almost like a surface color only. And it also catches the shadows, which is very, very nice. So with that in mind, I'm gonna start playing a little bit more with shading, and here I'm activating the subdivision, just because some of the models were looking a little bit blocky. And for the cornea of the eyes, I'm gonna add a glass like material, and for the eyes I'm gonna have pretty much like a standard material with a ramp, with a radial ramp, just to kind of illustrate it, a little bit of an eye shape. So I've added a ramp, and I'm tweaking the colors a little bit because they're a little bit on the bright side. So I kind of want to tone it down and make it a bit more neutral. And right now I'm gonna set up 3 main shaders, which is gonna be a medium clay, a dark, and a light clay. And like I mentioned, this is something that we do in production. Depending on the show you're working on, you're gonna get your shaders in your shader library. So as a modeler, your job was gonna be to literally just drag and drop the materials on your model, and that is usually left on the artist to kind of present it the way you feel like it's gonna read better. So here I made my light material, my light clay material, and I'm gonna duplicate it 2 times. I'm gonna make a medium and a dark one. And usually, like we apply the dark material on hair and eyebrows and eyelashes, and we apply the medium gray or medium dark to the some of the clothing pieces, and that just makes a nice visual difference. As you can see here, it kind of creates a contrast. So when the art directors are viewing your models in dailies, they would instantly kind of connect with the character, kind of see it a bit better. If everything is the same kind of shade, if you have a lot of details, it can be pretty hard sometimes to kind of make out those details. So this is some of the techniques that we use to kind of save some time. In dailies, you only have like 10-15 minutes at the most to kind of get feedback for your artwork. So you want to make sure that you present your artwork in the most appealing kind of way possible, because at the end of the day you want to get a buy off, and even if your model is great, if you don't present it well, it's not gonna look all that great. So this kind of presentation can go a long way in making sure you get approval on your models. And something that we do sometimes, especially in the design sculpt stage, is you would apply materials to faces. That is not recommended for the record, but for like a model, for like final production model. But if it's just a design sculpt that you need like a quick read, then it's totally fine, because that's gonna be taken over by a shading and texture artist, and they're gonna do the proper material assignments, and pretty much all of this clay kind of work that I do is gonna get discarded by the texture artist and the shading artist. And after this, I took the model in ZBrush and I sculpted just very quick normal map details, and I've added them back onto my model. And pretty quickly I'm gonna transition to that. And one change that I did from this is I've increased I decreased actually the roughness from 0.6 to 0.5, and that just makes some of the of the normal map details more visible. So this is kind of the final render that I would use for presentation. As you can see, Redshift is blazing fast, and here is the final model. So thank you guys for sticking around, and I hope you liked it, and I'll see you in the next presentation.